Just a Miller philosopher. In my last video, someone made a suggestion to me that I hadn't really considered before. If Elendur, the eldest son of Isiludur, had actually survived the Battle of Gladen Fields. Now, at first I thought this was like an earlier video I did on if Arnor had not fallen. But after thinking it through, I decided that this was different. Because in this potential timeline, Arnor and Gondor had never become separate kingdoms officially. So, what would this Dunedain kingdom be like in the Third Age? Well, put simply, drastic. Like, bigger than normal drastic. So, I had to break this up into sections. And I'm not going to go really in depth into this because it's probably just too much for me. But, here we go. First off is that Sauron's plans to defeat the Dunedain would drastically be altered. The shit he pulled in the main timeline will not work here. First, it's the Isilings that kick off the war into the Third Age in the main line. Now with the United Kingdom, they may still angle for Gondor since it is geographically closer, but they also might be pushed into pressing into the north as well. And like I said, this is not going to work. Even with the possibility of them suffering from the loss of manpower from the war, the Dunedain would still have enough people to basically slam the Easterlings from the north and south, whichever flank they choose to attack. They go for the north, the south hits them, and vice versa. And this especially comes into play when you consider that if the High King of the United Kingdom was an aggressive High King like some of Gondor's kings were, who may choose to take the fight to the eastern tribes rather than just let them attack them. Any attack on one will basically leave the other flank open, as I said before. And, even a greater threat, if the north and south then combined into a single force, a single hammer as it were, and then drive that hammer deep into the eastern part of Middle-earth. Would this nullify Sauron's attempt to use the Eastern tribes as proxies? No. However, it does put them at a serious disadvantage, given all the land that they now must cover just to get to the heartlands of either the north or south portions of western Middle-earth. Thus, while not completely neutralized, the Easterlings become a much more lesser threat, or at the very least, much more manageable. And this also means that there is no Angmar, and thus no Angmar wars, or at least for a great while. The Witch King would have to do something else to try his pincer attack on the Dunedain, if indeed that's even still an option at this point. Which I think there's a potential for that, but more on that a little bit later. The Dunedain could also form an alliance of sorts with the Woodland Elves and the Ravanian tribes in the east, thereby strengthening even more so the northern quarter, and making it even more difficult for the Easterlings to get further into the northern portion of the Dunedain kingdom, if by some chance they got that far. Now, this also would by nature affect the Dwarves in Khazad-dûm. Those events I think largely stay the same with the exodus from Moria. However, a stronger Dunedain would get word of this and may even try to assist the Dwarves into finding a new home or assimilating into the Grey Mountains or Erebor or Iron Hills, which I think would still come about, and the reason being for this because they fought with them before. That being said, the infamous war between the Dwarves and Orcs would therefore also be drastically different, I think, in that now it could potentially involve the Dunedain, though it's questionable given how introverted and personal the Dwarves were about their business. They like to keep their private affairs to themselves. However, an army of Dwarves marching through the land, even from the Far East, isn't going to go by unnoticed, and an accountability was going to be held to the High King at the very least. In which case, I can easily see the Dwarves kind of saying, "We got personal business with the Orcs in the Misty Mountains, stay the fuck out of our way, and we won't bother you." The war was that personal, but that's a whole other thing. Anyhow, I think the wild card as far as the northern quarter is concerned is going to be, however, the dragons of the north. And it's here where Sauron and the Witch King may actually try to make an alliance, or even if possible, subjugate them into their army they're trying to build. The Angmar Wars and the War of the Dwarves and Dragons would be replaced by a war between the Witch King and the dragons, with the Dunedain, the dwarves, and potentially even the elves. And this would put the northern portions in more danger because, dragons. That being said, the dwarves still had weapons to deal with dragons per se, so they would probably share this information with the Dunedain. That being said, even if they do manage to hold their own, there's still the question of Smaug, who fucking flies, and who is considered the greatest dragon of the Third Age. Gandalf in the main timeline ventures the question of what would have happened had Smaug been unleashed during the War of the Ring. And in this timeline, this becomes even more so a possibility, because one, Smaug will be drawn to the success of the Dunedain along with the other dwarves, and two, that he doesn't have the wealth of Erebor to distract him at this point. And then three, it's still questionable to me if he would even ally himself with the Witch King, much less Sauron, given how strong his will is by himself. And while Sauron is still a Maiar, he's a Maiar no longer at his full strength as he once was. And this is not a mortal, much less a dwarf or an elf. What about the orcs of the Misty Mountains? I think they would still be largely wiped out between the Dwarves, backed by the Dunedain, as well as the Dunedains themselves in the south when they flee to the south, because again, hammer and anvil. And what about Gondor, the southern portion of this United Dunedain Kingdom? They would prosper much better than they had even in the main timeline, with not only more resources available to them, but now their northern flank much better covered. So they would focus more on, I think, establishing a maritime empire for the United Dunedain. The capital of the United Kingdom still being Osgiliath, but Pilgar and Umbar, I think, would become the second and third most important places in that portion of the world. United Kingdom also means no king strife, since the High King in the north is the ruler over the entire kingdom, and would have the final say over if the king in the south died in battle for whatever reason and there was no one to take his place, even over the lords of Gondor. Theoretically. The Southern Wars would take on a different shape, and like my predictions that I talk about in my video on if Castamere had won the Gondorian Civil War, the war with the Haradrim become much more manageable. And again, Umbar is not going to be a problem. Sauron is going to be much more hard-pressed to try and genocide these people this time around, unless one potential thing occurs that I can see happening. And I can see this happening for one or two reasons. One is that what causes Gondor and Arnor to have all the headaches they have in the main timeline is not only a split after the death of Elendur, but also the separate cultures that develop afterwards. Even when Elendur was killed, after all, Arnor was still strong for quite some time before it eventually broke up into three separate realms. Therefore, there were still significant cultural differences between the North and the South, despite being the same race and the same lineage, just as it is in real life. Peoples can look alike and come from the same land, but still have completely different subcultures. This could potentially cause problems down the line if, say, for example, Gondor started seeing themselves as being different culturally speaking from the North, so much so that perhaps they should be their own separate kingdom. Or if the Lords of Gondor start having problems with the High King of the far north, more or less telling them what to do or having the final say over what goes down. It's a Game of Thrones type scenario, but I think plausible even in Tolkien's world. Gondor was always egotistical about their heritage and how they saw themselves, as well as their wealth and their own power. And a break from Arnor may not result in a civil war, but could potentially cause some strain. Both cultures revere their Númenórean heritage, so again, violence may not happen. But that being said, I can easily see them trying to pull, loopholes into trying to get around some things that they may not necessarily agree with, such as allying themselves with the Ravanian tribes, for example, similar to what happens in the main timeline. I don't know. It's a stretch, to be fair, so take it for what it is. This would be something that Sauron could take advantage of, since the key to his Third Age successes in the main line was the breaking apart of the Dunedain kingdoms near the beginning of the Third Age. And Sauron is nothing but if not patient. And this would definitely be a long-term op, because now instead of trying to take everything down by brute force, he's again relying on being subtle. And we've seen how long that can take him during the Second Age. However, the biggest factor if this played out would be if Elendur had taken the One Ring from his father at Gladen Fields, and thereby being in the hands of the High Kings of the Dunedain for that amount of time. The Dunedain are strong-willed, but they're not totally insusceptible to the manipulation from Sauron, such as the Númenóreans. If the kings had the ring, then the Dunedain could be corrupted or would be corrupted from the inside out, similar with what happened in Númenor, because the ring likes to corrupt people who have immense power, or any kind of power for that example. Then there's the question of the hobbits, and that one seems kind of simple enough. The hobbits would never migrate to Eriador, and would remain by the river in the valleys. So no real change there. And it might still lead to Gollum finding the ring, as he does in the main line, but in this case, even if that did happen, there wouldn't be a Bilbo per se to find it, or at least any reason why Bilbo would end up finding it, given the change in what happens with the Dwarven history. So basically, Gollum can keep the ring as long as he wants, and no one's gonna fucking know about it. And the other wild card that could happen in all of this is again going to be the wizards. What would the wizards do with a united kingdom that is in a much better position to defend itself from the attacks of Sauron? Keep in mind that the whole point to their intervention about midway through the Third Age was that the free peoples were vulnerable to Sauron's machinations and his power and his proxies. In this particular situation, though, that's not really a problem. If anything, kind of like how it's displayed in the movie The Hobbit when Gandalf interacts with Thranduil, the High King of the Dunedain may not even take him seriously, much less anyone else. And why would they? You're going to have a hard time convincing them that Sauron is somehow still a great threat to them, when essentially he hasn't been a threat for even a much longer time than he is in the main line. And I can still see them going to the Far East, and in this particular case, it would be all of them. So if anything, the way I see it, what would happen with the wizards would be that instead of being kind of spread out between the East and the West and Middle Earth, that all five of them would either go to the Far East or the Far South, finding out what's going on, plotting rebellions, or anything of the like. If they happen to survive long enough, and Sauron eventually gets his shit together so that he does become a major threat to the Dunedain, then I can see whoever's remaining coming back to the West and Middle Earth and trying to warn them of the potential threat. But again, that's going to be hard to do. But those are my thoughts on what would have happened if Elendur had survived. I want to thank the commenter for this idea, and if you agree or disagree with this, feel free to comment. But otherwise, this is the Miller Philosopher, and you guys take care of yourselves.